There's a piece of evidence from the Greg Biffle citation crash that cuts through all the technical analysis, all the aerodynamic discussions, all the regulatory debates, and reveals the raw human terror of what was happening inside that aircraft. It's not a cockpit voice recorder transcript. It's not a radio transmission to air traffic control. It's something far more personal, far more intimate, far more heartbreaking. It's a text message. A desperate message sent from inside that aircraft during the emergency, sent by someone who knew with growing certainty that they might not survive, reaching out to a loved one in what could be their final moments. The message said simply, "We're in trouble." 3 words that tell us everything about the fear, the panic, the dawning realization that this emergency might not have a happy ending. Today, we're going to examine this text message, what it reveals about the timeline and the crew's understanding of their situation, why someone chose to send a text rather than focus on flying, and what the human drama unfolding in that cockpit tells us about the final minutes of 3 lives. The existence of this text message was first revealed by NTSB spokesperson Michael Graham during one of the official press briefings following the accident. When asked whether the crew had declared an emergency, Graham initially stated they had no knowledge of an emergency declaration from the crew to air traffic control. But he then clarified, and this clarification is critically important, that they were aware of a text message sent from the aircraft by someone aboard, indicating they were making an emergency landing. Think about what that means for a moment. Someone inside that aircraft, while it was in the air during an emergency with one engine failed, took the time to pull out their phone, compose a text message, and send it to someone on the ground. That action tells us multiple things about the situation and the mental state of the people involved. First, it tells us that whoever sent the message had enough awareness and cognitive capacity to think about communicating with people on the ground. They weren't completely overwhelmed by the immediate demands of managing the emergency. They had a moment, however brief, to think beyond the cockpit, to think about loved ones, to think about alerting someone to their situation. Second, it tells us that the sender believed the situation was serious enough to warrant alerting someone. You don't send a text saying we're in trouble if you think everything is under control and you're about to land normally. That message reflects genuine fear, genuine concern that the outcome might not be favorable. Third, the fact that a text was sent rather than a phone call might tell us something about the noise environment in the cockpit or the sender's assessment of how much time they had. A text can be composed and sent in seconds without requiring conversation. A phone call would take longer and would be difficult in a noisy cockpit, with alarms sounding and possibly wind noise from an open baggage door. Fourth, the timing matters. We don't know exactly when during the approximately 10-minute flight the text was sent. Early in the emergency sequence? Midway through when they were maneuvering back toward the airport? Late when they realized they might not make the runway? The timing would tell us a lot about when the sender's assessment shifted from "we have a problem" to "we might not survive this." Now, the NTSB has not publicly stated who sent this text message. They've confirmed the message exists, they've confirmed it indicated an emergency landing was being attempted, but they haven't said whether it was sent by Dennis Dutton, Jack Dutton, or Greg Biffle, and they haven't stated who the message was sent to. This information is almost certainly known to investigators. They would have obtained phone records as part of the investigation. They would know who sent what message to whom and at what time. But they're not sharing that information publicly yet. However, we can make some reasonable inferences based on the context and what we know about typical behavior in emergency situations. The message was reportedly sent to a family member, which suggests it was sent by either Dennis or Jack to someone in the Dutton family, or by Greg Biffle to someone in his family. The wording, "we're making an emergency landing," or "we're in trouble," suggests the sender was including themselves in the situation, was aboard the aircraft, was experiencing the emergency. It's also worth considering who aboard would have been most likely to send such a message. If Dennis was flying the aircraft from the left seat, actively managing the controls and the emergency, he would have been extremely busy. His hands would have been on the yoke and throttles. His attention would have been on instruments and outside references. Taking time to pull out a phone and send a text while actively flying would have been difficult and potentially dangerous, distracting from the critical task of controlling the aircraft. If Jack was in the right seat, his workload would depend on what he was actually doing. If he was making radio calls, as the audio evidence suggests, he was busy with communications. But if he wasn't running checklists because he didn't know how, if he wasn't managing systems because he wasn't trained for it, he might have had moments where he wasn't actively engaged in flying tasks and could have sent a text. If Greg Biffle was in a passenger seat, he would have been the least busy of the three in terms of flying the aircraft. He would have been watching the emergency unfold, possibly understanding from the warnings and the aircraft behavior that the situation was serious, possibly not fully understanding the technical details, but definitely aware they were in trouble. For a passenger in that situation, especially one who himself was a pilot and understood aviation, reaching out to family to let them know what was happening would be a very natural response. The content of the message, "We're in trouble," or "We're making an emergency landing," reflects a specific level of understanding about the situation. It's not, "We might have a problem," or "We're checking something out." It's definitive. "We're in trouble. We're making an emergency landing." That language reflects understanding that this is serious, that the outcome is uncertain, that this is not a routine situation. The psychological state of the sender is worth examining because it tells us something about how the emergency was being perceived and experienced. In aviation emergencies, there's often a phenomenon where the crew goes through stages of recognition and acceptance. Initially, when something first goes wrong, there's denial or minimization. It's probably nothing serious. We can handle this. This is just a minor issue. As the situation develops and more information becomes available, that denial gives way to recognition. Okay, this is actually serious. We have a real problem here. But there's often still optimism, still belief that the problem is manageable. We can handle this. We've got procedures. We've got training. We'll get it on the ground safely. Only when the situation deteriorates further, when attempts to resolve it aren't working, when options are running out, does full recognition set in. We might not make it. This might not end well. I need to prepare for the worst. The message, "We're in trouble," suggests the sender had reached at least the second stage, recognition of seriousness, and possibly was moving toward the third stage, recognition that survival wasn't assured. The fact that someone took time to send this message, to reach out to family, suggests they wanted loved ones to know what was happening, possibly wanted to say goodbye in case they didn't survive, wanted to make sure that if the worst happened, family would have some understanding of what occurred. Now let's talk about what was likely happening in the cockpit while this message was being sent, because understanding the technical emergency alongside the human drama gives us a more complete picture. Based on all available evidence, the right engine had failed catastrophically, likely due to ingesting items from the open baggage compartment door. The cockpit would have been full of warnings. Master warning lights illuminated, engine failure indications across the panel, possibly fire warnings, oral alarms sounding. The aircraft would have been maneuvering at low altitude in marginal weather, probably below 2,000 feet, trying to get back to Statesville Airport. Visibility was limited, cloud ceilings were low. Finding the runway, getting lined up, judging altitude and distance would all have been challenging. The pilot flying, almost certainly Dennis Dutton, would have been hand-flying the aircraft with asymmetric thrust from one failed engine, requiring constant rudder pressure to maintain directional control. If Jack was in the right seat making radio calls, as the audio evidence suggests, he would have been communicating their position and intentions on the local frequency. But if he wasn't qualified to run checklists or manage systems, he wouldn't have been providing the level of crew support that a qualified first officer would provide. Dennis would have been trying to do most of the emergency management himself while also flying the aircraft. In that environment of high workload, high stress, warnings and alarms, marginal visibility, low altitude, the decision to send a text message becomes even more significant. It represents a moment where someone aboard chose to focus their attention not on the immediate demands of managing the emergency, but on communicating with the outside world, on reaching out to family. That choice suggests either that the person sending the message wasn't involved in flying the aircraft and had the mental space to think about other things, or that they had reached a point where they felt the outcome was largely determined and wanted to use the remaining time to connect with loved ones. There's also the question of when exactly the message was sent. Was it early in the emergency, within the first minute or two after the engine failure? That would suggest the sender recognized immediately how serious the situation was. Or was it later, perhaps after attempts to line up with runways weren't working, after it became apparent they were running out of altitude and options? That timing would tell us when the shift occurred from "we can handle this" to "we might not survive this." The NTSB has this timing information. Cell phone records show precise timestamps for when messages are sent. They can correlate that timestamp with the aircraft's position and altitude based on radar and ADS-B tracking data. They know exactly where the aircraft was and what it was doing when the message was sent. But again, they haven't shared that information publicly. There's another aspect of this text message that reveals the human drama, and it's the choice of what to say. "We're in trouble." Not a detailed explanation of what's wrong, not technical details about engine failure or emergency procedures, just a simple, clear statement of their situation. "We're in trouble." That simplicity suggests urgency, suggests the message was composed quickly without time for lengthy explanation. It also suggests the sender might not have fully understood all the technical details of what was happening. They knew enough to know they were in trouble, knew enough to know this was serious, but possibly didn't know or couldn't articulate the specific sequence of failures and decisions that had led to their situation. For the person receiving that text message, probably a spouse or family member, imagine the terror. You get a text from someone you love who's supposed to be on a routine flight. The message says, "We're in trouble," or "We're making an emergency landing." What do? You can't help. You can't do anything. You can only wait and hope and pray that the next communication is, "We landed safely," rather than silence or worse news. The U.S. Sun, in their reporting on the accident, interviewed Jonathan Donahue, Dennis Dutton's neighbor, who provided other details about the Dutton family and the circumstances of the flight. While the specific details of who received the text message haven't been publicly confirmed, it's reasonable to assume it went to a family member, most likely a spouse, and that family member would have received the message, would have immediately understood the gravity of the situation, and would have been helpless to do anything but wait. Minutes later, the aircraft crashed. The message sender, along with everyone else aboard, was killed. For the family member who received that text, "We're in trouble," became the last communication, the last words from someone they loved. That message is now both evidence in an investigation and an artifact of unimaginable personal tragedy. From an investigative standpoint, the text message provides important corroboration of other evidence. We have radio transmissions where Jack announces, "We've got an issue here." We have the text message saying, "We're in trouble." These are consistent. They both indicate the crew recognized they had a serious emergency. They both indicate communication about that emergency. They both reflect awareness that the situation was abnormal and dangerous. The text message also helps establish timeline. We know the flight lasted approximately 10 minutes from takeoff to crash. If the text was sent early in that sequence, it suggests the crew recognized the seriousness immediately. If it was sent later, it suggests their assessment evolved over time from "we have a problem" to "we're in serious trouble." The NTSB will use this text message as one piece of a larger evidentiary puzzle. They'll correlate the timing with other events. They'll consider who sent it and what that tells them about crew roles and situational awareness. They'll analyze the wording for what it reveals about the sender's understanding and mental state. All of this will factor into their eventual determination of what happened and why. But beyond the technical investigative value, this text message represents something profoundly human. It represents fear. It represents the desire to connect with loved ones when facing possible death. It represents someone taking a moment in the midst of chaos and emergency to reach out and say, "I need you to know we're in trouble." That's not just evidence. That's a window into the human experience of those final minutes. For Greg Biffle's family and friends, for the Dutton family, this text message is a reminder that the people aboard that aircraft knew what was happening. They weren't instantly killed by a sudden catastrophic event. They experienced the emergency. They knew they were in danger. They had time to be afraid, time to hope they'd survive, time to realize they might not. That knowledge that their loved ones experienced fear in those final minutes adds another layer of grief to an already unbearable loss. The text message that revealed the crew's panic, that showed us the human side of this technical emergency, is one of the most significant pieces of evidence in this investigation. Not for what it tells us about aircraft performance or crew qualifications, but for what it tells us about the human experience of facing death in an aircraft emergency. 3 people aboard that citation knew they were in trouble. They communicated it, they reached out, and then minutes later, they were gone. If you found this analysis meaningful, if you want to continue following this investigation with sensitivity to both the technical details and the human tragedy, subscribe to this channel. Share this with others who want to understand not just what happened technically, but what the people aboard experienced. And remember, behind every accident statistic, behind every NTSB report, are real people who experienced real fear and real loss. Thank you for watching.